Hi, I'm Mandy Peltier, and I'm an artist and instructor. I predominantly work in the fine art medium of colored pencil, and there is also a very special place in my heart for teaching beginners the tips, tricks, and techniques they need to be successful. I believe in making the arts accessible for all, and I can't thank you enough for being here today. I really hope you enjoy this video.
Hey everyone, welcome to today's tutorial. So today I'm going to teach you how to paint peaches on watercolor paper, only we're not going to use watercolor cakes or pans. We are going to use watercolor pencils. Now I love using watercolor cakes, and I've made a couple sort of freestyle watercolor paintings using peaches as my subject matter. So there's one and here's one, just sort of that loose style where you allow the water to bleed into all the surrounding colors, and it's popular right now on digital wallpaper, greeting cards, botanical wall hangings, all sorts of things. And I thought, I'm a colored pencil artist predominantly, and watercolor pencils are considered colored pencils, at least by the Colored Pencil Society of America. So could we achieve that same loose style watercolor effect with watercolor pencils like we can with watercolor cakes and tubes? And I think I have found a way to do that. So here's the one I did using watercolor pencils, and I'll just compare it to one that's maybe somewhat similar using the watercolor cakes and pans. And you can see that, they have a pretty similar flow and feel and look to them. So those of you who have followed me as an artist or have taken a workshop with me, you are probably already familiar with the fact that I have drawn some very photorealistic peaches before, and I'll pop a couple of them up on the screen so you can see what I mean. So this is definitely a different style than what I normally do. I would not consider this photorealistic, at least not like my usual colored pencil work. But sometimes I just like to do something a little more free and relaxing and maybe less realistic and quicker to do. I will say that watercolor pencils are not going to be as quick as painting these peaches using watercolor cakes or tubes. It is a bit more time consuming because you draw on the pigment first and then you wet it with water. But I do think watercolor pencils combine the best of both worlds. You get the look of watercolor, that transparent, beautiful color, and just how the water bleeds into all the other colors, and it just creates this flowy effect. I love watercolor. So it gives you that effect, but it also gives you the precision and control of using colored pencils. So I do hope you enjoy this tutorial, and if you like this video, like it, leave a comment, follow, subscribe, whatever you feel like doing. Thanks again for watching. Before we begin with the actual peaches tutorial, I want to first explain and demonstrate something I have found to be true with watercolor pencils. And that is, unlike with watercolor cakes or tubes, a single application of color isn't generally enough to achieve the same intensity or saturation that you would with traditional watercolor cakes or tubes. A single layer of watercolor pencil on paper and then smoothing it out with a wet brush will yield a fairly light value. If a light value is what you want, then one layer of pencil is probably all you need. But for these peaches, we will apply a few layers of color before we first go over top with water and then dissolve the pigment to create watercolor paint. So I want to demonstrate for you what just one layer of color looks like when you use watercolor pencils compared to a single layer of color using a couple different brands of watercolor cakes. I've chosen cakes for this experiment because cakes first come in a dry form, just like watercolor pencils, and then they achieve the watercolor look by applying water over the pigment. So this watercolor set here is Sennelier. And Sennelier is a super nice brand of watercolors. They are pricey, but you do get what you pay for. This is a more affordable brand of watercolor cakes called Koi, and I have been impressed with their quality. I won't lie and say they're as good as the Sennelier, but if you're looking for a good starter set that's maybe on the more affordable end, I would recommend the Koi. And the color I have here is Prismacolor Watercolor Crimson Red. And so I'm going to use this color to demonstrate what I'm talking about with the watercolor pencil. And I'll use this red color for the Snellier and this color here for the Koi. And they're all about the same value and hue, which is why I'm choosing those three colors. My brush is completely dry for this experiment, and the watercolor cakes are completely dry for this experiment. So what I'm first going to do is with the Crimson Red, I'm going to draw a small swatch of color. I'm going to use handwriting pressure, a back and forth stroke, and I'm going to be careful to keep my strokes close together. But I'm only going to go over each section one time. Okay, so there's my little swatch of color for the watercolor pencil. Now with a round brush, I'm going to hold it in the water for a few seconds, and then I'm going to wipe it along the rim of the cup 3 times or so. And now I will run it over my watercolor pencil that I applied. Now that was just one single stroke over it. And if you can see with the camera, it doesn't completely smooth the strokes. So I do have to sort of go over it a few times with my brush to sort of get that pigment to dissolve and for the strokes to blend smooth. And so when I'm done with that, you can sort of see that it's a fairly light value. So now I'm going to try and achieve the same amount of water on the pigment with the brush and with these traditional watercolor cakes. So I'm going to clean this brush by swishing it a couple times, and I will wipe it again 3 times on the rim. And then I will just wipe it over that. I just did it, maybe 3 times. And then I will apply it right next to the watercolor pencil. And you can see that this is a much darker or more intense saturation of color than what I was able to achieve with the watercolor pencil. Now let's see what happens with the Koi watercolor. I'll clean my brush for a couple seconds, wipe it 3 times, so there's about the same amount of water on the brush. I'll rub it onto the Koi watercolor cake, and then I'll apply that right next to the Snellier. So they're not exactly the same hue, but I think I've demonstrated enough that the watercolor pencil has the lightest value. Now I understand that the amount of water you use with watercolor cakes determines the intensity or saturation of color. But I just want you to understand why in this tutorial we are adding a few layers of watercolor pencil down before we even apply water over it. So now I'm going to use this Crimson Red pencil again, and I'm going to make a new swatch of 1 layer. And now I'll make a second layer. I'm using pressure 3 or handwriting pressure again in a even back and forth stroke. And here's number 3, and I will do one more, number 4, because there will be approximately 4 layers of color on most sections of the peaches. And now I will swish my brush to clean it. Once again, wipe it 3 times along the rim. And now when I apply the wet brush over the watercolor pigment, not only does it smooth the strokes much more easily, but look at how much more saturated that is. The color, the intensity, it's even more saturated than the Snellier. Now, don't get me wrong. If I were to apply more Snellier pigment to my brush and apply it right next, we can achieve the same hue, the same intensity, the same value. But this is why we are going to apply a few layers of color before we go over it with water. There are colored pencil artists who use watercolor pencils for the underpainting primarily, where they will apply watercolor pencil as the first layer and then apply water over it. And then when it dries, they'll go over it with traditional colored pencils, or they may even let it dry and then go over it with more watercolor pencils to continue to build up the values and the color and the intensity. But because we want to sort of mimic that loose watercolor effect that is popular right now on digital wallpaper, greeting cards, prints, etc., we're going to do this, where we're going to apply a few layers of color and then apply a lot of water over it so that the water can run into all the colors can bleed into each other, and it can mimic that loose watercolor effect. What I'm doing here is technically step 2. I have already transferred the line drawing to the working watercolor paper, And now I am using just the eraser on a number 2 pencil to partially or mostly erase the graphite lines so that they will not show at the very end when I'm done with this drawing / painting. I'm erasing it to about a 25% opacity. One thing I want everyone to know is that this YouTube video is complementary to the written tutorial that you can find on my website. I actually consider the written tutorial primary and the YouTube video secondary. So if you need to learn how to transfer the line drawing onto the working paper, you can refer to the written tutorial. I'm not showing that on this YouTube video. As you can see, there's some eraser buildup as I erase the graphite lines. You can use a drafting brush, or I'm even using just a bristle paintbrush, and you can just swipe them off of your paper. And then you can see if there's any areas where maybe you need to erase a little bit more. The goal should be that you can still see them slightly, but just not as clearly as before you go over the lines with an eraser. So like I said earlier, the goal is about a 25% opacity. This step is optional. You don't have to do this, but if you don't do it, the graphite lines will show through at the very end. Welcome to step 3. I need to apologize in advance if you have a hard time seeing what I'm doing in this step. My camera is having a hard time compensating for the brightness of the paper, and it keeps readjusting the brightness level. And I've played around with the settings and I just can't figure out how to compensate for that. I think it's just the camera. So like I said earlier, this video tutorial is actually supplementary or secondary to the written tutorial. So please do look at the written tutorial, step 3, in order to have a better idea of what I'm doing here. But this step uses liquid Frisket, which is similar to rubber cement in its consistency, drying time, how it kind of peels from the paper. And the purpose of liquid Frisket is to protect areas where you don't want any paint color on them. So we're going to use this for the highlights on the whole peaches where the indentation is, and then just random other areas to just create some visual interest when we're done. A lot of loose watercolor artists will intentionally leave areas of the paper without any color, and that's a bit easier to do when you're just going in with a brush and wet watercolor. It's a little bit harder to do with watercolor pencils, so in order to sort of achieve that same look, we're going to do that with liquid Frisket. I also have a toothpick here to apply the liquid Frisket. We'll basically just draw it on in the areas that we want to leave white. So I'll begin by drawing it on to the peach indentations to create a little highlight there. And I'll shake up the liquid Frisket a couple of times to just sort of move what's inside and mix it all together. And liquid Frisket dries really fast, so you'll need to work fairly quickly. But the good news about liquid Frisket is if it dries and you don't like where it is, or if you apply it and you don't like where you put it, you can let it dry and then peel it off or wipe it away, rub it away. I usually use a paper towel. I wouldn't recommend using your fingers because the oils may get onto the paper, or any dirt on your fingers could smudge onto the paper. But you can use a paper towel to just sort of rub it off, which you'll see in the very last step. So I'm going to dip my toothpick in the rubber cement, and then I'm going to just carefully draw a highlight adjacent to the indentation on the whole peaches. You can sort of work with the liquid Frisket a little bit as it dries to push it where you want it to go. So let me add this to the highlights on the peaches first.
And you can always add more to your toothpick if you need, if what you have on there isn't enough, but I'm just working with a little bit at a time. I'll show you what you can do if you accidentally blob a whole bunch of it on there. You can do what I mentioned a second ago, where you can let it dry and then rub it off. Or if you accidentally blob a whole lot, like, well, I didn't mean to blob it there, so I will have to let that dry and rub that away. But if I blob a lot, like right there, I can work from the blob and kind of pull it out with my toothpick where I want it to go. So while it might be a little bit thick where the blob is, it'll become thinner where you sort of pull it away with the toothpick. Now, in order just to create some random places with no pigment, or we're going to preserve those areas so we don't get any watercolor on those areas, I use sort of a parallel toothpick rubbing technique. So I'll just sort of place the toothpick pretty much parallel to the paper, maybe at a slight angle, and I'll just rub it onto the paper. And then I'll just get a little bit more. I don't use much liquid Frisket for this, or I'll have like a whole solid section that doesn't have any pigment on it. The less wide side of the peaches is the highlighted side, so it might make sense to rub it along that section as best you can. And maybe I will just use this blob and I'll pick it up to apply it to other areas versus going into the liquid Frisket and picking up some more. So I'm just rubbing it on, and then I'll just sort of rub that away too. So then I ended up saving that little blob that I put where I didn't mean to. For the peach halves, the lighter side is going to be the left side of the peach pit, so it might make sense to put rubber cement on that side. For the leaves, if you wanted, you could do some middle veins on a few of them. You don't have to do all of them, but maybe just a couple here or there. And then on other ones, you can do the parallel rubbing technique. Now, because some of the rubber cement is super tiny and there's not much of it there, it's very likely that as you add color, some of it may rub away, and that's okay. But in the later steps, we're just going to do our best to avoid or work around the rubber cement. I keep calling it rubber cement. It's liquid Frisket, but they're pretty similar, so I apologize for calling it rubber cement because I am actually using liquid Frisket here. But you'll just sort of work around the liquid Frisket with your pencil as you apply color in the later steps. So I think I've applied enough of this liquid Frisket to this piece. Maybe I'll just put a little bit right here. And then I'm happy with that. I think that looks good. So now what you'll want to do is wait for the liquid Frisket to fully dry before you move on to the next step. After letting your liquid Frisket dry for a few minutes, you are now ready for step 4. In step 4, we are going to use one pencil color, and that is Prismacolor Watercolor Canary Yellow. And we are going to apply this color to all of the peaches and to the leaves. This is going to create just a nice base color. We're sort of working from light value to dark value in this tutorial. And since the green of the leaves is comprised of yellow, and since peaches have a lot of yellow in them, this is a great base color to start with. Yellow also mimics the color of light, so it will add a really nice light effect on the final piece, some of that yellow shining through the watercolor on the leaves and on the peaches. So yellow will be applied to the entirety of the leaves, but remember to work around any liquid Frisket that is on them. I'm using a back and forth stroke along with handwriting pressure, and I'm trying to be even. And while I'm maybe not being as careful to cover every square inch of the tooth on this tutorial as I would be if I were using regular colored pencils, I am being careful to at least make it even and have full coverage. The reason why I'm maybe not as concerned about coverage with watercolor pencils is I know that I'm going to dissolve the pigment with water in a later step, but I still want to have several layers of color and to have those colors have a lot of pigment down so that when I apply water over the pigment, it will be saturated and intense in its hue. Just like when I showed you that little demonstration with the watercolor pencils versus the watercolor cakes, and how we can sort of get the same intensity and saturation of color with the pencils as we do with watercolor cakes. With the peaches, the whole peaches, it's the same thing. We're going to apply this color to the entirety of the whole peaches. So I won't show you that now. You can watch the sped up version if you would like. Let me talk about the peach slices. So the peach slices, there's a middle top section where if you were to look at a real peach slice, it would be red in color. We're not going to apply color where we'll later apply red. So you'll apply it to the entirety of the peach slices other than to the middle top section. So you can sort of watch me here work around that middle top section. But I will apply it to the rest of the peach flesh on the peach slices. The written tutorial says to use a back and forth stroke. If there's an area where it's hard for you to stay in the lines with a back and forth stroke, it is totally appropriate and okay for you to use a scumbling stroke or any other stroke that is comfortable for you. But when I am working with watercolor pencils, let me rephrase that. When I am working with colored pencils, the stroke I use is very important. When I'm working with watercolor pencils, it's not as important because I'm going to apply water over the pigment and smooth it out. Okay, so now let's talk about the peach halves. Let's start with the pit. On the pit, there's a section of the pit on the left-hand side that looks sort of like an oval. We're going to apply yellow to that part, but we're going to work around the circles that are in that little oval section. So a scumbling stroke might be a little bit easier for you here than a back and forth stroke, since it's a small area and you're working around those circles. And then after you have it applied to that oval part of the pit, then you'll just apply it to the peach flesh in the same way that you applied it to the peach slices and to the skin of the whole peach. So now you can watch a sped up video of me doing the same process to every little thing on this piece.
You are ready for step 5 now. In this step, we will be using 2 colors, Prismacolor Watercolor Grass Green and Spanish Orange. The grass green will be applied to the leaves only, and the Spanish orange will be applied to the peaches only. I'll show you the leaves first. With the leaves, we do not want to completely cover every square bit of yellow that we applied in the last step, because when we go to apply water later on, we want the grass green and the canary yellow to mix together to create sort of a yellow green. So when I first did this tutorial, I basically concentrated the grass green along the bottom of the leaves, and then I applied it mostly to one side of the middle so that it creates a bit of a shadow or darker value. And then I sort of soften it up towards the top, or feather it, if you will. And on one side I apply a lot less than on the other, and I sort of leave the top blank. So I'll show you that one more time on this one. So I'm using a back and forth stroke, handwriting pressure, concentrating it more on one side than on the other. I haven't even gotten to the other side yet, to be fair. This one I might bring it up a little bit further than the other leaf just to add some variety. And now I'll add some of this color to the other side. All right, so that's what you're going to do with the leaves. Just vary where you put the color, maybe bring it up further on one side than on the other side, on one leaf than on the other leaf. But for the most part, concentrate the color towards the bottom of the leaf and then on one side of the leaf. I'm still not worrying about the stems yet. I don't want the stem to get too thick. And so we're going to apply one more color to the leaves in the next step, and I'm going to use that color for the stems. Now, as for the peaches and for Spanish orange, as I had mentioned in a previous step, the darker side of the orange is going to be the wider side of the indentation. So we have a wider side here, and we have a more narrow or less wide side here. So the less wide to enunciate there of each peach will be the lighter value, or sort of where the light source is hitting the peach. So it's okay to add a little bit of Spanish orange around the edge, and you should certainly apply Spanish orange along each indentation, but this color will mostly be applied along the edge of the wider half, and then you will sort of work it into the middle. And don't go all the way over to the indentation. Maybe stop where there's about a quarter left to the indentation, but fill in just about everything else with this Spanish orange color. I'm not going to extend it all the way down to the tip here, but maybe to about right there. And then I will bring it in towards the middle and meet up where I've already applied Spanish orange. I'm aiming for even coverage here. And I'm still using, I think I'm using a combination of a large sculling stroke and a back and forth stroke, but you can just use a back and forth stroke and then just sort of meet it into where you applied color up top at first. And then you'll repeat that for every whole peach. For the peach slices, we are still not going to add color to the middle top section where we will be adding red in another step. I am going to apply it to the flesh part. I'm going to work my way around the edges. I'm going to do that first, work the edges, and then I will come back down to the middle and I will apply a little bit up towards the center. But again, I'm not completely covering the canary yellow. I'm only bringing it up a little. For the peach halves, it's going to be the same as the peach slices. I'm going to begin by applying it along the outer edges, and then I will bring it in towards the middle, but still leave a gap between where I applied Spanish orange and where the pit is, so that it's just the canary yellow color that we applied in the last step. So with that, you can watch me finish up this step, sped up, and I will see you in the next step. We are now ready for step 6. Step 6 uses 4 colors. Dark brown, which will be used on the peach pits. Dark green, which will be used on the leaves. Poppy red, which will be used on the peach slices. And orange, which will be used on all of the peaches. I'll start with orange because orange is going to be used in a very similar way that Spanish orange was used in the last step. So I'll show you first on the whole peaches. You will apply orange along the indentation, a little bit along the right side edge if you want, the narrow or less wide side of the peach. And then you will apply orange on the wider half in the same way as Spanish orange, only do not cover all of the Spanish orange color you applied in the previous step, nor go into the areas that are only canary yellow. So essentially you will apply orange to about right here, whereas you applied Spanish orange to about right here. So you will leave a little area that is only the Spanish orange. So let me demonstrate that for you real quick. I'm just gonna fill in orange along the edge first and then sort of work it in towards the middle. Not applying this color quite as far as I did Spanish orange. I'm still not worrying about the tip here yet. I'm going to do the tip in the next step using a red color. To the slices, it's much the same as with the whole peaches. If you want, you can add just a touch of it along the edges of the peach. Peach flesh is pretty yellow, so if you apply orange on the peach slices, just do so very sparingly. The same goes for the peach halves. If you apply any orange, just do so very sparingly. One thing you can do is you can sort of outline the heart-shaped curves that are along the peach half, and then the center curve, you can sort of define that now with the orange if you want a little bit. So I'll pretty much just apply orange along the top curves carefully. I hope you do it more carefully than I'm doing it right now, because I'm talking and working at the same time. So it makes it a little bit harder to get things right. And then I might apply it just a touch along the edges. But again, the flesh of a peach is more yellow than it is orange or red. So I'm being
careful with that. So that's how you will use orange on the peaches. Now let's move to, how about poppy red? I'm not necessarily going in the same order as what's on the written tutorial, but all of this is in the step that we're currently working on. So for poppy red, I'm just going to use various back and forth strokes, squiggles really, to fill in red along the top middle section of the peach slices. Just like that. I'll show you again. So I'm just doing little squiggles going in different directions to mimic what is on a peach slice when you cut it, the indentations that are sort of left from the pit. And that's all for the poppy red in this step. I have one more down here, so I'll show you again in case you need another slow demonstration of that. I'm not really being careful with it. I'm just sort of squiggling. Now we'll do the dark brown next since we've been working on the peaches. These are for the peach pits. So I had mentioned in an earlier step that the right side of the peach halves are going to be the darker side. So we're going to outline the right side of the peach pit using this dark brown color. And you might have just seen that my tip broke, and it's going to be really hard to lift it from that area, but it's okay because we're going to apply crimson red along here soon. So you're not even going to know when this is all said and done. So I'm just outlining the right half. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully fill in the circles. I have found that watercolor pencils seem to be a bit more prone to breakage than regular pencils. And so when they do break, I try to move it as fast as I can, but it's not always as simple as that. And then I'm going to outline all those lines that are on the line drawing. If you can't find some of them because, we erased and maybe they've erased further as you've been working, just sort of draw some in. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then you can draw in a few extra circles if you want. And then I will show you again down here. I'm going to draw in these circles, outline the lines that I have, and I'm still just using handwriting pressure. If it doesn't go on dark enough, you can go over it twice. And now I'm going to fill in this and this. Okay, so that is the dark brown. Now for the green is for the leaves. And just like the orange was very similar to Spanish orange in this step, dark green is very similar to the green we used in the previous step. So this is going to be the darkest value on the leaves. I'm going to once again concentrate it along the bottom part of the leaves. I'm going to draw a thin stem at the bottom, and they don't necessarily need to connect. You could add some interest if you have some stems that are a bit further down below the leaves. So that's up to you. That's a creative choice. And just like with the orange, how I didn't completely cover the Spanish orange I applied in the previous step, with the dark green, I'm not going to completely cover the grass green that I applied in the previous step. I'm going to leave some just grass green showing. And then, of course, I'm still leaving some of the canary yellow showing from the very first step. So that is how you're going to complete this step. I've already shown you the dark brown and I've shown you the poppy red. So I will show you a sped up video of me continuing to apply the orange and the dark green.
Yay for step 7. We are chugging along. In this step, we're going to use 3 colors. Sienna brown on the peach pits. Poppy red, once again, on the peaches, but to different parts of the peaches than in the last step. And crimson red, which will be used to those peach slices, the upper middle section. So I'll show you that. So basically with crimson red to the peach slices, you're going to go over some of the poppy red using the same kind of squiggle, scratchy coloring stroke, I guess you could say, not completely covering the poppy red. We're just adding a darker value on top of the poppy red. So once again, I'm just being pretty random with it. I'm not really taking my time because I know that this is all going to be smoothed out with watercolor and take on a watercolor appearance. So that is the crimson red. We'll use this again in the next step. As for the sienna brown, we're using these on the pits. We are going to apply it to the entire pit, even over the other 2 colors we've already applied on the pit. So just apply it evenly onto the pit in one even layer. Okay, and then the last color in this step is poppy red. Since I already worked on the peach half with the sienna brown, I'll start with the peach halves. So to the peach halves, you can use poppy red to further define the curves along the top of the peaches. We'll also use poppy red to the whole peaches. I'll begin by applying it along the indentation. And this time I'm only going to apply it to the wider side, not to the thinner or less wide side. So in the same way I applied Spanish orange and orange, I'm going to go over both of those colors, but I'm not going to completely cover the Spanish orange or the orange. I love peaches because the flesh of the peach just has so many colors on it, and I don't know, there's just something about peaches that are so happy. And I love an analogous color palette where colors are directly next to each other on the color wheel. And really that's what peaches are. They are the epitome of an analogous color palette. So maybe that's part of the reason why I'm so attracted to peaches. But, you know, they are absolutely delicious. They're one of my favorite fruits, especially if you can get some fresh Georgia peaches or fresh South Carolina peaches. So that is it for poppy red. Another place we're going to use the crimson red beyond the top middle section of the peach slices is we're going to apply it around the pit. I'm going to do it in sort of a similar way that I applied the reds to the upper middle section of the peach slices. I'm just going to sort of squiggle around the peach pit. And the reason why I'm squiggling around is if you were to look at a peach half slice, it's not a perfect sort of shape around the peach pit. It bleeds out into the yellow and it's sort of squiggly. It's okay to sort of define the edge a little bit after you put in the squiggles, but that's sort of how I went about applying this crimson red color to the peach halves.
And just like that, we're ready for step 8. This step uses 2 colors. It uses Sunburst Yellow, which I'll show you last, and it uses Crimson Red. We will be applying Crimson Red to 3 areas that we haven't applied it to yet. We will apply it to the whole peaches, we will apply it along the curves of the peach halves, and we'll be applying it very conservatively to the pits. So to the pits, you'll just add, just using your handwriting light pressure, just to a couple areas. It doesn't have to be the same areas, just a couple areas so that we can add a little bit more color and variety to those pits. To the whole peaches, you will once again apply it to the peach indentation and along the whiter side of the peach in the same way you've applied all those other colors. These peaches are really starting to just look like a basic colored pencil peach with the different values and colors and shading. But just remember, they will take on the watercolor look as soon as we start to apply color to them in the next couple of steps. And then to the peach halves, also apply it along the curves. And you might just slightly scumble in a little along the top of that middle half. For the Sunburst Yellow, we've mostly been following a light value to dark value process, which is the general way I like to work on white paper. So technically the Sunburst Yellow should have been applied after Canary Yellow was applied, but this is one of those judgment calls that you often make as an artist when you look at your piece and you think, you know, what do I need to change or what do I need to add? And when I got to this part in the process, I thought we just needed a little bit more shading to show that the whiter side of the peach is the darker side, that the right side of the peach half is the darker side, etc. So Sunburst Yellow will be used basically on the darker sides of the peaches. So for the peach halves, you'll apply it to the right half of the peach, going over the colors you've already applied, working up to the red that goes around the pit. And you can see already how that creates some nice shading. So it's easier to identify that the right side is the darker side and the left side is the lighter side. As for the whole peach, you will be applying Sunburst Yellow mostly along the right, well, the whiter side. It's the right side on this peach, but the left side on this peach. So the whiter side of the peach, you will apply the Sunburst Yellow. And you can overlap it a little bit with those other colors you applied in the previous steps. Now, as for the peach slices, there's not an obvious light or dark side like there is with the peach half and the whole peach. So you can apply Sunburst Yellow to the left half of each peach slice, to the right half of each peach slice, or you can vary it. Because I have some liquid Frisket on this side, I'm going to consider on this particular slice, this the light side and this the dark side. So I'll apply Sunburst Yellow on this peach slice to the left half. Same on this one. I happen to have the liquid Frisket on the right side, so I'm going to apply Sunburst Yellow to the left half. On this one, it happens to be the right side because the liquid Frisket is here. And on this one, it's the right side because the liquid Frisket, I cannot speak today. Liquid Frisket is here. There, that's better. And so just repeat the process with all of the peaches, with both the Crimson Red and with the Sunburst Yellow. I'm going to move back to the Crimson Red as this video fast forwards.
It is finally time to add water to those peaches and leaves. So this is an exciting and fun step. It might be a little bit intimidating if you don't normally use watercolor, but I really do think using watercolor pencils and then wetting them with the watercolor brush makes it a little bit easier to maintain control, to kind of push the water where you want it to go, etc. So you will need a few things for this step. You'll need a clean glass of water, a number 6 round brush, a number 2 round brush, and once again, grab your canary yellow pencil. We're going to use a drop technique with the leaves. And another thing I have here is a Caran d'Ache palette aquarelle. You can easily have a scrap sheet of paper nearby to achieve the same effect that we're going to use the Caran d'Ache palette aquarelle for. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to scribble some canary yellow on this palette aquarelle, and then we're going to pick up that pigment with a wet brush. So we're basically using this as a watercolor cake on this. So you can do the same thing by drawing a back and forth swatch using canary yellow on a scrap sheet of watercolor paper and then lifting the pigment with a wet brush. But there will be less pigment waste if you use a Caran d'Ache aquarelle. You may be able to use a plastic cutting board that has a little bit of texture. I haven't tried that, but you could try that if you want. All right, so I'm going to kind of put this off. Well, I'll keep it here actually, and I'll put this up here so it's not in the way. As far as the brushes go, you could use a number 6 for everything, but I'm cognizant of the fact that a lot of people watching, this may be your first experience with watercolor. And so I have a number 2 brush for the leaves, just so you can have a little bit more control, especially with the stems to keep them skinny. But if you have control with watercolor, you may prefer just to use the number 6 round brush. If I were just doing watercolor, I would just use a number 6 round brush. But I understand that, some people may want a little bit of a smaller brush for those leaves. So I might demonstrate both, or use the number 2 for the demonstration part and then use the number 6 when it's all sped up. I also like to keep a paper towel sort of handy in case I need to wipe my brush on it, or if I get too much water on my brush and it kind of makes a mess on the paper, I can blot it up real quick with the paper towel. So that might be something handy to have nearby also. So I'm going to begin by showing you the leaves and then that drop technique using the palette aquarelle or a scrap sheet of watercolor paper. So my brush is dry right now. I'm going to put it in the water for a few seconds. And then I'm going to wipe it along the rim of the glass a couple times. And I'll start with the stem. I'll just very carefully, almost holding it up and down, just at a slight angle, carefully just put the very tip along the bottom stem to wet it. And let the water just sort of dissolve the pigment on its own and leave it. Don't do any more than that, or you might risk making it a little too chubby. Now, for the actual leaves, you can wet your brush again, wipe it 2 to 3 times along the rim. And then I like to start along the bottom and work my way up to the top. So I'm going to just use my brush and drag it on each side of the bottom leaf. And as soon as there's such a concentration of pigment that there's no water to really push around, I wet my brush again. You might have to wet it a bit more at first as the bristles absorb water. And then as we work towards the peaches or on the other leaves, you may not have to wet it as much. But do you see how that gets thick right there? It's already time to add a bit more water to my brush. And then I'm just going to sort of work my way up to the yellow along the top. And then you can switch and then work from top down if you want. Just take your time. There's really no hurry. And you can see how that yellow has already become a bit of a yellow green. That's exactly what we want. If there's some pigment that's not really dissolving, we'll just go over it again with the wet brush. And now let me show you the drop technique. So I'm going to take my canary yellow and I'm going to scribble a little bit on this palette aquarelle. I'm going to clean my brush because there's some green on it. And without wiping it on the rim, I'm going to use that wet brush to pick up the pigment
And so now we've made watercolor pigment with the palette Aquarelle. And I'm just going to drop it into the leaf. And it looks like we need a little bit more here. Wet my brush again, pick up that pigment. And we want to drop it in while the water is still wet on the leaves to help it kind of bleed into each other and create a loose effect. And so you will just repeat this process with the other leaves. I work leaf by leaf at a time so that the water doesn't dry for the drop-in part. And you don't have to do the drop-in part. If you like how it looks without adding that extra drop of yellow, you can just wet what's there and leave it alone. But let me now show you the peach pits, because that is the other part that we are turning into watercolor paint in this step. I don't know how else to say it. So I am using a number 6 brush for this. Again, if you feel more comfortable with the smaller brush, go for it. And so I'm going to dip my brush, my number 6 brush, in the water for a few seconds to help the bristles absorb the water. I'm going to wipe it a few times along the rim. And I'm going to work section by section. I'm going to start with the area where I first added yellow. And I'm going to work around the dots at first. And I already need more water. Work around the dots at first. I'm being careful around the red. You likely will wet some of the red around the pit, but just try to keep your focus as the pit itself. And then after I wet the yellow, I will then just drop water onto those dots to let them dissolve. And then I'm just going to sort of work my way around the pit, working section by section. You can see how that red we applied sort of changes the appearance there. It's so lovely. I love how that looks. And just whenever you need, whether it be each section or just when you don't have a lot of water to work with, wet that brush again. And in a lot of ways, the water will just soften the pigment itself and sort of do the job for you. You'll just want to be careful to make sure that your pencil strokes are not visible and that it's at least all been sort of dissolved with the water. So I would say that peach looks good. Resist the urge to overwork. It could be very easy to do that, but resist that urge. If you want, what you can do at this point is you can get your dark brown pencil, which I need to find it again because I didn't get it out. And you can go over the dots while the water is still wet. You can even go over the darker pigmented areas, the little indentations within the pit. You can even run over that with your dark brown pencil. And you likely won't need to go over it with a watercolor brush because the water or the paper is already wet. And so the pencil will sort of dissolve with the water. So that's sort of a nice thing about putting pencil directly onto wet paper, is it sort of softens it for you, but it does make it a much more concentrated dark area of color. So if you want, you can go over those areas with the water if you sort of want to bleed them better into the areas, but that's a totally optional thing. It's not something you have to do. All right, so that's how you do the peach pits. So now the video will speed up as I sort of show you the other leaves and I work on the other pit at the bottom of this piece. We are ready for step 10. In step 10, you may need the palette aquarelle. I did not use it when I wrote the initial tutorial, but I did use crimson red, and you will only need the number 6 round brush. So in this step, we're basically going to turn all of the pigment we have applied on the paper into watercolor on the peaches. So I'm going to wait to show you the peach halves because the water is still drying a little bit. So I'll start maybe with this upper whole peach, dipping my water. You can't see my water. Let me move it over here. Dipping my water or my brush in the water. I'm wiping along the rim a few times. And I am going to start on the lighter, less wide half. So I'm going to take my wet brush and I'm going to apply it, wiping it around that light half. The yellow dissolves so beautifully. I'm going to work right up to where I applied the liquid Frisket early on. And then I'm going to work my way over to the darker, wider section. So again, apply more water to your brush as often as you need to help the water move and bleed into the other colors you have applied. I'm going to now apply some water over that indentation. And look how vibrant this side is compared to that. That Spanish, the sunburst yellow really made a difference on the wider side, so I'm so glad I did that. You have a lot of pigment down on these peaches, so you might need a little bit more water than you did with the leaves, because the leaves had 3 layers of color, but some areas of these peaches have, I think, 5 layers of color. So the pigment may become a lot thicker on the peaches than even on the leaves. And we definitely want to have enough water on the paper so that all the colors can sort of bleed and transition into each other. So this is where if you feel like you need more red, crimson red, you could take your crimson red pencil and do the same thing as we did with the canary yellow, where you scribble some on with a wet brush, pick up some of that pigment, and then drop it in. And then just let it dry. Resist the urge to overwork. I do not like how solid this line is here where the orange meets the yellow, so I might just feather that out a little. And then I'm just going to let it dry. That's one of the hardest things, is to show restraint and let the water do its thing. But that is sort of how we get that loose, flowy effect. All right, with the peach slices, I am going to apply the wet brush to the peach flesh first. And then I'll work my way up to the middle top section that has the reds. And I'm just going to basically take my wet brush and just sort of dab it over those areas. I'm going to let it bleed into the yellow just a little bit. And now while your water is still wet, you can take your crimson red and draw in a few more zigzaggy lines, just like we did by adding dark brown to the wet pits. Now for the peach halves. I'm going to start by applying water to the curves along the top. And then I'm going to work my way around the sides and then in towards the peach pit. But I'm not going to add water again to the peach pit because we've already wet the peach pit. So I'm going to be careful working around the pit. If you have to turn your paper to get the right angle, you can do that. I like to do that. It helps me. All right, and now we're ready for the red surrounding the peach. So I'm just sort of going to dab at it in the same way I did the upper middle section of the peach slices. And I have a lot of water on my brush, so I'm not needing to re-wet it. If it bleeds more than you'd like, grab the paper towel and kind of dab it on the water to absorb. The good news is it bled on the lighter section of the peach half. So even lifting it with some paper towel adds a little bit of interest. You can go in with a wet brush and just sort of smooth any yellow that's there. And I see some areas here that didn't really get the wet brush. So I'm going to just go back over and make a few of those adjustments. Now, just like with the peach slices, you can now go in with the crimson red over the wet paper and add in a few more scribbles or lines. But that's how you do the peach half. If you want to, I don't like how this curve looks, so I might go in very lightly with crimson red along that curve just to darken it up a touch. You just got to be careful to not let it get away from you. So I'm going to repeat the process I've just shown you with all the other peaches on this paper. And we are ready for the last step. That's super exciting. I am going to use white in this step. But before I use white, what I'm going to do is get a clean piece of paper towel, and I'm going to use that to lightly rub off the liquid Frisket we applied early on. Now, you could use your fingers, but I wouldn't recommend it because you've made it this far, hopefully without making a mistake like I did. And I would hate for any oils or dirt on your fingers to smudge the beautiful work you've done. So paper towel works great, and it sort of protects any oils or dirt from getting onto the piece. So what you will do with the paper towel is you will lightly rub it. I'm using at most handwriting pressure, but probably a little bit less than handwriting pressure. And I'm just rubbing it over all the areas where I applied liquid Frisket. It might be hard for you to figure out where you applied it at this point. So you might just rubly, I just made up a word. You might just lightly rub it across each section of this piece to make sure that you do get it all. Okay, and you can see it left a little bit of residue, so I can just lightly wipe that off with my paper towel, or you can use your drafting brush, whatever you have. And so you can see now how it sort of preserved areas of the paper so that even when we used the watercolor brush, the wet watercolor brush over the pigment, it still didn't place that color where we applied the liquid Frisket. So liquid Frisket is a watercolor artist's best friend, and it makes some things a little bit easier. But I just love how it sort of creates this little effect where it leaves some areas without any color. It just adds some visual interest, I feel like. So with the white pencil, what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply it to areas of the peach pits just to create some highlights. You may have added liquid Frisket to the peach pits, in which case you may not need to do this step. But I did not add any white or any liquid Frisket to the peach pits, so I just want to mark in some highlights. I'm sort of looking for the lighter areas on the peach pit, and that's where I'm going to sort of strategically add some white. You can add a little bit or a lot. It's just really up to you. And I am not going to wet this white with a brush. I'm just putting it on dry. And at this point, you could make any other adjustments you might think needs done. You might take your crimson red or poppy red, and you could lightly scumble along the edge of the peaches. That was poppy red there, and I'm not really noticing a difference, so let me see what the crimson red does. And this is completely optional. This is just if you sort of want to further outline or define certain sections of the peaches. And again, I'm just going to leave this on dry. You could wet it again, but I would be afraid it might change the appearance too much. So it's more just to sort of create a hard edge. But again, that's completely optional on my piece. I did it just to a couple of sections. You can see how it just slightly darkens that edge, and you can feather it in as much as you want. But again, that's completely optional. But the white I would encourage you to do just so there's some highlights on those peach pits. So that's it. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you learned a lot from it, and I hope to see you next time.